Hi, I'm Ray Steelman, and today we're going to take a little hike back into the Cumberland Plateau. We're going to take a little trip back in history, and we're going to go back to the old Issac Criner home place. To tell you a little bit about where we are, we're approximately 2 miles north of New Market, Alabama, and about 2 miles south of Plevna, Alabama, and we're about 4 miles from the Tennessee state line in the northeastern part of Madison County, Alabama. You know, we're very lucky here in Alabama with the great heritage we have, the history we have, and today we're going to learn a little bit about the history of this particular part of the country. Here where we are now was once called Hickory Flats back in the early 1800s when the first immigrants came in. Down here below us, we're standing on Steel Lane, which turns into the old Winchester Highway a little further up the road. That was one of the first immigrant trails into the northern part of what's now Alabama. This particular part down here before us is flat. We come right out of the mountains into the flatlands. This was called Hickory Flats because it was very flat, a very fertile land. It was a land rich in game, fertile soil, rich in every way. Now back during that particular period of time, these fields were full of forest. We're told that the trees were so big that when you cut a tree, a man couldn't look over the top of it. In fact, the trees were so big that there was very little undergrowth, and the early settlers tell us that you could see a deer running as far away as a quarter of a mile. So as you can see, things have changed. The first immigrants came in here around the latter part of the 1700s and began settling on this particular land in the early 1800s, around 1803, 1804. Now, Issac Criner was the first settler in Madison County. Now, there were some folks that came through and visited, but he was the first permanent settler in Madison County. About 3 or 4 months ago, I hiked back over in the mountains and I found his old home place, and that's what we'll be doing today. We have a pretty good hike before us, so let's get started. This part of Madison County has a lot of wildlife and a lot of natural resources, and on our trip this morning, if we're lucky, we may see some deer and wild turkey. There's a coyote back here. Here's a tree, a pin oak tree that was struck by lightning. I hiked back here about 5 or 6 years ago. The tree had just been hit by lightning then, and I remember it blew pieces of the bark as far away as 40 to 50 feet. And I really expected the tree to be dead, but as you can see, the tree's alive and doing well. So it appears that our old friend's going to make it right here. This is just a sample of some of the things we'll see on our trip. We have about a 2 to 3 mile walk, and we'll be going back into Miller Holler. There was a Miller family apparently that lived back here. There's an old cemetery a few miles over to the direct north of here. That's the Miller Cemetery. So I suppose the Holler and the family have some kind of connection. We're on the Floyd Moore property. Floyd Moore and his father, A.L. Moore, have had this property for a number of years. We'll see some old abandoned home sites and just have a good little journey on this good, nice, warm spring day. Let's get on our way again. Here's one of the old home sites that's been long abandoned. I don't know much about this piece of property, but you can tell by looking at that house that it was not just an ordinary sharecropper's home. There's a lot of detail up here at the end of the gables. You see the millwork on the molding. The house had 3 fireplaces. It had an upstairs, and I've been in it several times. It has some turn posts in there on the stairway, so apparently, these people must have been fairly well off. Back in behind the home, a few minutes later, we'll pass some tenant or slave quarters. I'm not real sure what they were. The old chimneys are still standing. We'll probably get a look at those. But I've heard this house was abandoned back in the 20s. So that's about all I know about it. There's a English walnut tree right here in the front yard that in the fall I often come up here and get me a handful of walnuts and crack the walnuts. You know, it's just really nice to be able to get back here in the foothills of the Cumberland Plateau and kick your feet up a little bit. Well, we're still in the front yard of the old home place. The view in our camera now is what was known as Hickory Flats. You can see how flat the land is coming right out of the mountains into those flat plateaus. We are told that during that period of time this was all in dense forest. In fact, the forest was so dense that the settlers actually cut the trees, piled them in big piles, and burned them. They called that log rollings. And they'd call all the neighbors around. There'd be 40 or 50 men rolling logs, piling them in piles, and actually burning them to get them out of the way. The first corn crops that were raised in this area were planted between the trees, these huge trees we're talking about. As you see, the trees are long gone, and what we have now is mostly in cultivation down there. The ancestors of the Indians who lived in the South came to this continent more than 20,000 years ago, and they came from Northwest Asia. And we think that they got here over a land bridge or maybe an ice bridge, or they could have come by boat between what is now Siberia and Alaska. They came here in pursuit of the large animals that lived here in the North America at that time, the bison and the mammoths. And these animals gradually moved eastward and southward, and of course they were followed by the Indians into what is now Alabama. The first Southerners we know about lived in the Paleolithic Indian period, which began about 12,000 years ago, or around 8,000 BC. They hunted large, now extinct animals and ate smaller animals and plants, and since they were looking for food, they stayed on the move. Archaeologists have discovered many ancient campsites not very far from where we are in North Alabama. From the Paleolithic period, the Indians moved into the Archaic period. This happened when the large animals became scarce, and this period lasted from 8,000 to around 2,000 BC. This period is characterized by more stable home lives, less traveling about, and most of the Indians lived in caves or under rock ledges. The next period is the Woodland period. Now these southern Indians learned to cultivate crops, they learned to dry meat, and they invented the bow and arrow. They learned to weave cloth and made a lot of personal advancements during that time. This period lasted from about 2000 BC to around AD 800. In the evolution of the Indian culture, the next period is the Mississippian period. It lasted from AD 800 to 1500. The Indians during this period formed tribes. They had chiefs and priests, and many became mound builders. Now this is when we think the mounds were built in Moundville, Alabama, about 100 miles from where we are now, and the mounds over at Etowah, near Rome, Georgia. These Indians during this period learned to make jewelry, they developed tools, and they sophisticated their weaponry. The next period would be the historic period, and this began around 1500 or about 500 years ago and lasted to the 1830s. Now this is the period in which we're talking about and studying about during our little hike this morning. When the first immigrants came to this part of the country, it was a pretty hard life. Most of them either walked in or rode an ox or mule or horse, and they brought with them very little. Many times just an axe, a dog, and maybe a few wedges. The sanitation was a big problem for them. A lot of the children died at very early ages. Childbearing took its toll on the families, and it was not uncommon for a man to have 3 or 4 wives after losing each wife. So times were pretty hard. The land was a rugged land, and about the only medicine available was morphine that some of the doctors would bring in. Supplies were approximately 100 miles away from where we sit right here. Salt was almost something you couldn't get. Although there was a lot of civilization about 70 miles to the west of where we are, there was really very little in here until about 1804 when the first settlers came in, 1803, sometime about that period of time. Now the Natchez Trace is about 70-75 miles due west from here. Of course, the Natchez Trace was an old buffalo trail that was later turned into an Indian trail, and later a trading trail for the early pioneers, that was well traveled, and because of that, settlers settled up and down the Natchez Trace. Then Muscle Shoals was a trading center. There was 5 miles of land that was bought from the Chickasaw Indians that was turned into a trading center, so there was a lot of activity over there. But for this particular part of the Cumberland Plateau, it was pretty much left alone until the early 1800s. To give you an idea of how tough the land was, you can see this rock wall. We're told this rock wall is well over 150 years old. We're unsure of exactly when it was built, but you can see the size of the rocks and how much time and labor it must have taken to build this wall. There are very few of these still standing today, and this is just a little piece of our country that helps us understand the real hardships that the people suffered during that period of time. You know, it's pretty difficult today to find anything that's left from the old pioneers 200 years ago, but if you're very careful and you look very hard, you can find a few remnants. Here's an old site of one of the pioneer homes. We have a fireplace. Don't know much about it. We know it was built a long time ago. You can tell between the rocks they used clay and mud to build the fireplace. Of course, it's long gone. The old home site's hardly visible anymore. But you know, you can't help but wonder what children were raised here, and what lives were touched, and what souls were saved, and you know, your imagination can really run away. But if you get out and look real carefully and spend some time outdoors, you can find a few of these old home places still left. There's a reason that most of the early pioneers came in to this part of the country on foot or on horseback. As you can see, it would be pretty hard to try to get in here with a wagon or buggy. Back then, of course, there were no roads, no way to get in other than to walk. This gives you an idea how rough the terrain really was. Well, we've hiked up to the top of our first little mountain range. We're coming into Miller Holler. Now, Miller Holler is about a 4-mile long holler that is right down below us here. This is one of the natural gaps in the mountain, and it's, you know, it's not beyond belief that maybe the first settlers came through this very gap where we are right today. They looked for these places because it was easier to get through these gaps. So it's a good possibility that they came in here. We know they settled at both ends of the holler, so I would say they probably came right through this gap. In the late 1700s and the early 1800s, this was Indian territory. It belonged to both the Cherokee Nation and the Chickasaw Nation. They shared it as a common hunting ground, although neither nation actually claimed the land to be their own. In Alabama during that period of time, there were 4 main tribes: the Chickasaws, the Cherokees, the Choctaws, who lived over in the southwestern part of the state down around Tuscaloosa, and the Creeks, who lived down in the southeastern part of the state around the Dothan area. Alabama gets its name from Alabamos, which is a Creek-related tribe. It stands for those who clear the land. Back in the early to mid-1700s, Shawnees also were prevalent here in this part of North Alabama. The Chickasaws and Cherokees got together and drove the Shawnee Nation back north of here, and they ended up around Nashville, and from Nashville up into Kentucky. So by the time the first settlers came into this part of Alabama, it was primarily Chickasaw and Cherokee, and mostly they were not hostile. They were thieves. It was not a good idea to leave a horse in a place where they could get their hands on them or anything outside, and we're told the early pioneers locked up things at night, and for the most part, if they did get anything, you could get it back by going before the chief and requesting that the thief return the property, which was most of the time promptly returned. The story goes that Issac Criner had some horses stolen back over here, right behind us in this valley, by some Cherokee braves. He traced the horses over to around Guntersville, and Issac went before the chief, asked his horses back, and promptly got the horses back. So for the most part, by the time the settlers came into this part of Alabama, the situation with the Indians was pretty stable. And that was not true, of course, down in South Alabama. The Creek Indians were a very hostile tribe. The largest massacre of white men in this country took place down at Fort Mims down in South Alabama. And that massacre, along with some other problems with the creek, led Andrew Jackson to gather men from this part of Alabama, from the western part of Alabama, and from southern Tennessee up around Lincoln County and Fayetteville. They went down to South Alabama, down just north of Dothan, over in that area, and defeat the Creeks in several battles. Of course, the biggest battle, and the one we hear the most of, was the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Well, we've reached the very heart of Miller Holler. The Criner home place is about maybe another mile down here. We've walked about 2 miles. The holler itself is about 2 miles in that direction, and maybe a mile and a half in the direction north of here. The first immigrants that came in here came in approximately a mile as the crow flies in this direction over the mountain just to our west, or there's another immigrant trail back over on this side that it's suspected a lot of them came through. There's a possibility they could have come down this holler because there's a cove back to our direct north, and there's some cabins, some old home sites and cabins back there. So we know some at least came down through the heart of this part of Madison County. You know, immigration in this part of the state started very slowly. We have to remember that there were some people, scattered people that wandered through here, but the first permanent settler only came around 1803 or 1804. But by 1809, the census shows us that there were 2,223 people living in Madison County, Alabama. Now, you have to remember that a big portion of all the county at that time was still in Indian Territory. So it wasn't even legal to be here. To come in Indian Territory, you had to get a permit to even come in here from the government. Now, the territory line, some of the land was purchased from the Cherokees, and the line was actually about a mile in this direction right here. So what a lot of the people would do, they would come over here and build a house in Indian Territory, and they'd have a house right on the other side of the line. Now, it got to be such a problem and disturbed the Indians to the point that the federal government sent soldiers down here. And the soldiers would run the people back across the line, and as soon as the soldiers were gone, they'd come back and live on this side of the line in Indian Territory. Now, the Criners did this. Issac Criner and his family had a house over in what's now Jackson County, and they also had a cabin back over here in Indian Territory. So the troops got to the point that they would burn the settlers out. They would actually burn the cabins down. That never happened to the Criner family, primarily because pretty quickly this property became a part of the United States territory. Well, we're going to hike on a little bit. Again, we have about another mile or so to go. So come on, let's see what we can find out. Well, we're almost there. We just crossed the fence, and we have about 300 yards in that direction, and we'll be there. So it's a little bit further of a walk than I thought it was, but we'll be there very quickly. So let's go on over and look at the old home place. Well, we're here. The little building down here is a deer hunter's cabin, and it's built pretty much on the side of the old Issac Criner home place. So let's go down and take a look. Well, folks, we made it. And as the story goes, the first three men in this part of the country were John Hunt, John Ditto, and Issac Criner, along with his uncle Isaac, and Stephen McBroom, who was the first cousin of Isaac's. As the story goes, John Hunt, who was a hunter, would come into this part of North Alabama and would hunt, and he was from East Tennessee. He would go back to East Tennessee and he would tell the people about the rich, fertile land and the good hunting grounds down here. And of course, he stirred up some interest. As a result of that, John Ditto came down. Now, John Ditto was a trader and a riverman. We're not exactly sure who went to the big spring in Huntsville first, but as we were told, probably it was John Ditto. John Ditto went to the big spring and looked at it and decided that for what he was doing, being a trader and a riverman, he really needed to be on the river. So he moved further south to Ditto Landing just below Huntsville. John Hunt came later, looked at the big spring, and as a result of that, over the years, of course, Huntsville has been named after John Hunt. Now, Issac Criner and Joseph, his uncle, and Stephen McBroom went to the big spring, looked at the big spring in Huntsville, but they didn't like the water, the type water that was coming from the spring, and more than that, they didn't like the rattlesnakes and the rocks there that are around the spring. So instead of building there at Big Springs in Huntsville, they moved back out here to this part of the county. They found a big spring down here on Mountain Fork Creek, and they built a cabin on this site right here. It was a little two-room cabin at first. Then they went back to East Tennessee to get their family. These old home places sometimes are easily found by looking at the trees and the flowers that grow around the area. This particular site is marked by the old magnolia tree. Was found initially behind the old cabin in the old plantation home. You can see it's quite a large tree, probably stands somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 feet tall. Quite a large magnolia. The tree is beginning to show its age. From this angle you really can't tell it, but it has split over the years. We'll get a little better view of it in just a minute. But the old magnolia tree marks the old original home side of the Issac Criner cabin. Also, you can notice the flowers down here. These flowers were planted many years ago and have come up generation after generation here on the old home side of the Issac Criner home place. Shortly after John Hunt and Issac Criner and John Ditto came into these parts, of course, other people came along. There was another fellow by the name of Samuel Davis who found the big spring there in what's now Huntsville. And there's some controversy surrounding what happened. Samuel Davis liked the spring and had intended to live there, so he cut some trees and piled up some logs, and I think actually had built a lean-to, as the story goes. And he left at that time and went back into eastern part of Tennessee to bring his family down here to finish the construction of the cabin. Now, in the meantime, John Hunt had come back on another hunting trip, and he brought with him David Bean. And they stopped at the old cabin that was here and spent the night with the Criners. They went from that from the cabin the next day into Huntsville. Well, when he got to the big spring, he had intended to build there also. When he found the logs that Samuel Davis had cut and had left there at the big spring, well, he thought that maybe John Ditto had done that. You remember, John came to the spring, and then John moved on to Ditto's Landing. So instead of cutting his own logs, he built his cabin out of the logs that were left behind by Samuel Davis. So when Samuel Davis got his family and came back, he found that somebody had used his logs. He got pretty upset about that. In fact, he was so upset about it that he said he wouldn't be a neighbor to anybody that would steal another man's logs. So he came back to New Market and settled about 2 miles, a little less probably than 2 miles from where we stand right here. On this home site, the Criner family built 3 houses. The first 2 were actually cabins. The first one was a very small cabin. It only had 2 rooms, and since Isaac had 12 children, they outgrew it very quickly. Then the second cabin lasted a while longer, but they eventually outgrew it and built what they called the Plantation Home. Here's a shot of the old Plantation Home, the old Criner home. It took 2 years to build this home. It was built by 2 slaves, and it stood until back in the 50s. I think it was torn down around 1952, I believe. These old pioneer families were very tough people. They were very hardy, and they'd travel long distances over new, or in most cases no roads, through unbridged streams, and often waited for flooded ones to go down and had to camp overnight no matter what the weather was before they could get across the stream. Water had to come from a well that the pioneer dug, or more likely from a spring. Many times the spring was some distance away. Now Issac Criner Spring is at the foot of this hill. There's a steep bluff down there, and until old age blinded Isaac, he washed his face each day, every morning, without exception, in the spring. And we're told that oftentimes he would return to the house and he'd have icicles in his beard. For the old pioneer families, it was much easier to locate close to a good spring than to dig a well. You know, your wells back then were hand dug, and sometimes they had to go, pretty deep to get a good stream of water. So most all the old homes were located fairly close to a good spring. Now we have a Issac Criner Spring down here. We're going to take a walk down there. By the way, this is Mountain Fork Creek. The stream is clear, crystal clear, as we'll see when we get down there, just a good stream. So he had not only a spring for their own drinking water, but they had a good source of water for their cattle. Well, here we are at Criner Spring. Actually, Criner Spring is about 3 different springs, and they have a real good stream of water coming out of them. The Criners, after looking at Big Spring and Huntsville, thought that the water up here was better, not only better, but had more volume to it. The spring was not only a source of drinking water for the pioneer families, but it was also a way to keep milk cool and meat cool and other products cool. So what they would normally do is dig out a reservoir around these springs. When the water would come out, they would put their milk or whatever down in the cool water, much as we use a refrigerator today. It's about, from the spring, it's probably a good 50 yards or better down here to the spring, and they would walk down here each day, get the water, take it back to the house, and use it for their personal uses. Now, the smaller of the 3 springs is up here. You can see it coming out up there, a much smaller stream, probably from one source of water underground. Then the spring, there's one coming out here, large spring here, and then back over about 50 feet away, there's another good source of water. Now, the green stuff you see down there is watercress. That's wild watercress. Not many people know it, but Newmarket, Alabama is the watercress capital of the world. Now this is domestic watercress that's raised back close to the current town of Newmarket by B&L growers. Here's some of the watercress out of the Criner Spring. I mentioned earlier that Newmarket is the watercress capital of the world. B&L Growers is probably the biggest producer of watercress in Newmarket, and they ship to markets throughout the world: New York, Atlanta, and California, and it comes right from Newmarket. So if you see any watercress, you eat any watercress, or see any watercress on your plate, there's a good possibility that it came from Newmarket, Alabama. You just saw the magnolia tree that marks the old Issac Criner Homeplace. Isaac settled here in 1804. He built a cabin nearby for his uncle. And on this spot, Isaac and his wife Nancy McCain, whom he married in 1814, raised 12 children. They had 9 girls, and they had 3 sons. Later on, when the Civil War started, Isaac was 80 years old, and he lost his only 2 living sons at that time in the war. Alfred, who joined the cavalry, fell dead from his horse in Georgia, and his other son, Isaac McClure of the 4th Alabama Infantry, was killed from an ambush at Meridianville, Alabama, just outside of Huntsville. There's not much left that marks the old home place except a few scattered bricks. Here's some of the old handmade bricks. Apparently, I guess, came out of the chimney. And then we have a little mystery. There's a rock with some carvings in it. Let's take a look at that. If you notice, I hope you can pick this up on camera, there's a handprint right here in this rock. Looks like somebody maybe laid their hand down and took a sharp object and carved around the hand. And there's some other carvings on here that you can't quite make out. I really don't know what it is. Looks like maybe some initials and dates on here, but again, that's a mystery to me. Maybe somebody out there watching knows a little more about this than I do. Issac Criner was the first settler, permanent settler, in Madison County. There were many others that traveled through, but Isaac was the first one that stayed, tilled the land, and raised a family in Madison County. Now, shortly thereafter, there were many more that came on the scene, and Madison County began to grow very rapidly. You'll have to remember that when Isaac came here in 1804, he was actually squatting on Indian land. There was a treaty signed with the Chickasaw and Cherokees in 1805 and 1806, which deeded about 350,000 acres of this part of North Alabama to the United States. So after that point, it became a part of the United States. They were no longer squatting. But if you go to the courthouse and check the records, you'll see that the Criner family was not listed as a landowner until after the 1830s, when the Indians were moved to Oklahoma in the now famous Trail of Tears. Issac Criner lived to be 98 years old, and his descendants have gone on to be leaders in their chosen fields and have played a big part in the development and the growth of Madison County, Alabama. In fact, this piece of property right here has never been out of Issac Criner's family. It's still owned by his 5th generation grandson. You know, in order for us to know where we're going, it's very important that we understand where we've been. That's why history is so important to us. Always take time to look at what's around you. We have a lot here in North Alabama to be thankful for, in southern Tennessee. Let's get out and explore our historical heritage. Well, folks, it's time to take a walk back. We've got about a 3-mile walk, so let's pack up the bags and let's head toward the road.